Welcome to the Solar Investors Guide podcast, published by Photovoltaic Magazine and PV Europe. This first English language episode of the Solar Investors Guide is about redox flow batteries, more precisely about iron flow batteries. Flow batteries have the great advantage that power and capacity are separate. They consist of reactors and tanks with a liquid electrolyte in which the energy is stored. If you need more storage capacity, you simply use larger tanks and more electrolyte liquid. I've been talking to Alan Greenshields, Director EMEA at ESS, about the applications and opportunities for flow batteries on the battery market. My name is Carsten Schäfer. Hi, Alan. Welcome to the Solar Investors Guide podcast.
Well, Carsten, thank you for inviting me.
You are Director EMEA at ESS Inc. Perhaps you could briefly introduce yourself and your company.
Well, ESS is a US company based in Oregon, and they've been working for many years on developing and producing a redox flow battery based on iron. And I've been working with ESS for the last few years on introducing that technology to the European market.
Interesting. And what are the most important characteristics of a redox flow battery?
Well, I think to put that into context, it's good to talk a little bit about batteries in general. And if you take a conventional battery like a lithium battery or a lead acid battery, or any of the other types, in a battery, you typically have a positive electrode, a negative electrode. You have, between the two of them, an electrolyte, which has the function of letting ions or molecules transfer between the two electrodes. And the fundamental principle is that when you put electricity into the system in one direction, the electricity is stored by means of a chemical reaction. And when the chemical reaction reverses, it releases energy. But the critical difference with a flow battery is that compared to a conventional battery, in a lithium battery, for example, the energy, when you charge the battery, is stored in the electrodes. And the function of the electrolyte is to permit the ion flow back and forward between the electrodes. In a flow battery, the chemical reaction is taking place between you actually have two electrolytes, taking between two electrolytes, and the difference is that the energy is stored in the electrolytes. The interest in flow batteries is because if you're storing energy in the electrolytes and you wish, for example, to store energy for long periods, then the way to think about this is that you have your battery module, or the actual battery cell, with these two liquids flowing through it. They flow through it one way when the battery is charged, and the opposite direction when you discharged. What you've done is you've opened up the door for extending the amount of energy you can store by simply having big tanks of electrolyte. That's the quintessence. The quintessential difference is in a conventional battery, you store energy in the electrodes inside the cell, so you have a physical limit on how much energy you can store. And in a flow battery, the energy is stored in the electrolytes, which decouples the power from energy component of it. And if you want more duration, you flow more electrolyte through the actual cell itself.
Mm-hmm. So these are the main advantage, or this is the main advantage, would you say, or are there other advantages and disadvantages if you compare these two battery types?
Well, what they talk about with a flow battery is that in batteries there are two parameters which matter for if you're going to include this in any kind of electrical system. One is power, measured in kilowatts or megawatts, and the other is energy, measured in kilowatt hours or megawatt hours. One key difference of the flow battery is that those two things are decoupled. The power rating of the battery is determined by the cell part of it, which is like a small reactor system, and the duration part is determined by how much electrolyte you flow through it. So you talk about a decoupling of energy and power, which is definitely interesting when you start moving into the bulk storage of energy, where the key function of the battery, principal function, moves away from power towards energy. And this is really reflecting the changes we're seeing in the functions of batteries in the power grid as we move to more and more renewable energy. So in the early days of renewable energy going into the power grid, the primary functions which batteries undertook were regulation functions, frequency regulation, voltage regulation. And for that, you're talking about a power application where you need bursts of releasing power or absorbing power to help keep the system stable overall. And that's where the first deployments of lithium batteries were done many, many years ago in the PGM network in the United States. But as more and more of the actual generation base becomes renewable, the task switches. It doesn't. The task of regulation is still there, of course, but over time you need to find ways, as the amount of renewable generation goes up, of storing large amounts of electricity to use it later. And that's an energy function rather than a power function. And this is why there's interest at this point in time about the role which redox batteries can play in this as the proportion of renewable energy goes up and up and up over time.
How much later are we talking about?
Well, these things are. It's difficult to give a very definitive answer on that because power grids are extremely complicated systems. But there was work done a few years ago, 3 years ago, by the Long Duration Energy Storage Council. They did a lot of an analytical work, simulations of these things. And what comes out of that is basically, if you were to fast forward to 2040 and say we have a fully decarbonized grid, where all of the energy is produced by renewable sources, and then work backwards from that to say, what does that power grid need to look like? Then what comes out is a fairly consistent model. You need basically three things. You need short duration power batteries like lithium for these stability functions, because they're outstandingly good at doing that, because they have very fast reaction times and they're very controllable. Then you have a task of moving energy around to match supply and demand. And that, if you look at that task, it's hard to put an exact number on it, but about 80% of that, if my memory serves me correctly, is moving energy within a 24-hour period. Mm-hmm. And that's logical for two reasons. One is the cycle of human activity follows 24 hours. But the other aspect to that is that certainly for solar, you have a perfectly correlated 24-hour generation cycle. With wind, it's a bit different, because wind, you have other sources of variability, but you also have some day-night effect. So you have a huge task of moving energy around within a 24-hour period, and if you can do that, then you've solved a large part of the problem. You've not solved the entire problem, because you have multi-day periods of low output, and in fact, we've just had one. There's been a lot of headlines across Europe and in Germany about extremely high power prices, literally in the last few days. And the root cause of that is across Europe, they've had a multi-day period of low wind output, which means supply is low, demand is high, and prices have spiked. But just say in passing, the fact that that's worked and that the systems didn't collapse is proof positive that all of these new concepts are working. But going back to the theory of where we are now, then you have another requirement, which is to store energy for a few days. And then you've got the term, which again, it's a wonderful German term that's become incorporated into the English language now, Dunkelflaute. Dunkelflaute is basically the sort of the generic term for what happens if you have both low wind and low solar, which could, for example, be a 2-week period in December or November where the the solar output is low, and where, for statistical reasons, you just have little wind output. And you need a solution for that too, because you don't want will happen statistically just about everywhere in the world for about approximately once a year, once every 2 years. And for that task, that's where things like hydrogen are often viewed as being an appropriate solution, because it's a material you can store, and when this period comes, it can be turned into electricity. So you really have these three buckets of storage: short duration storage, long duration storage, and hydrogen. There are differences in opinions about where the boundaries between the different technologies are, but I think that this split into three is a very useful way to think about it, because each of these three buckets is a different task. The task of lithium is mostly about stabilization. The task of long duration storage is mostly about the bulk, I'd say the bulk of matching supply and demand to match the cycle of human activity. And the third part of it is hydrogen. And of course, what makes these things difficult to put precise numbers on is there are other things which can be done to match supply and demand. For example, transmission networks, and increasing the capacity of transmission networks is hugely important, and especially if these go east-west. They can help with the load shifting task. Just demand management, where you provide cost price points to provide incentives where people will use less power now and more power later. They all play a role together. But in all of these scenarios, energy storage is a really key piece, because it's the only asset class which can be both a source and a sink of power, and switch between these two roles very quickly. And that, from simply an electrical engineering point of view, is an extremely important function.
Mm-hmm. When it comes to redox flow batteries, there are two major types of cell technologies. That is vanadium flow and iron flow.
No, there's more than that. In fact, there's quite a. If you speak to an electrochemist, he'll list, probably he or she will list maybe half a dozen different chemistries.
Okay, but these are the main ones, I guess.
Well, you'll hear a lot of discussion about our so-called organic flow batteries. What people are referring to, as I mentioned before, you have two electrolytes. Mm-hmm. What people are referring to is what's actually in the electrolyte. Mm-hmm. What are the compounds which you're using for these reactions for storing and releasing energy? And the vanadium is referenced a lot because the vanadium chemistry is one of those which has been around the longest. It works very well. Technically, it's a good system, but I'd say the main criticism of vanadium systems is that the vanadium content itself is quite expensive. And if we go back to how flow batteries work, and if you imagine you have this reactor system, and you're flowing electrolyte through the reactor, and if you want to go to long durations, you want to flow large amounts of electrolyte through that. To get to a low cost point for the storage, you want the electrolyte to be cheap. And this is the challenge for vanadium systems, is that vanadium as a material, it's not really cheap, and therefore the question pursued by many R&D teams, including the team which developed the ESS system, is what molecules can you use which are suitable for storing energy, which are safe, which are non-toxic, which have all of these important other characteristics, but the ratio of how many kilograms of that material you need compared to a certain number of kilowatt hours is advantageous, and that results in a low cost per kilowatt hour as being the achievable value for the electrolyte. The attraction of iron systems is that iron is cheap, and that the iron compounds used in the case of the iron flow battery, ferric chloride, it's a material which is low cost. It is a relatively safe material. It's not a material where there's where anyone worrying about toxicity of these kind of things is going to have serious problems because essentially you can think of it as iron in salt water. So it has an interesting profile because of its low cost and because of its relative harmlessness compared to some of the other materials used.
Okay, and what are the main applications for your or other redox flow batteries?
I would say the overall application is, or the attraction of these is for bulk storage of energy. But what I would say is that once you've got a redox battery, you've made the decision to install one for a particular application, it can do all of the other stuff too. So there's not really a cut or dried one-for-one allocation to say it's good for this and bad for something else. They have certain properties, and as all systems do. But I would say the key difference I would say is for bulk storage, very large batteries, because of the safety profile of the materials used. That's very, very definitely a focal point for them. But there are other things you wouldn't use it for. You will never put a flow battery into an electric car. They're designed for bulk storage of low-cost energy. They're not designed to be small and compact and lightweight. So I think you'll see different batteries being applied to different specific tasks in the grid. And as I mentioned before, the grid has this very wide spectrum from batteries which are doing things in sort of seconds or fractions of a second for regulation in minutes and hours, up to a few days, and then up to ultimately a couple of weeks. So it's this spectrum is an important thing to keep at the back of your mind, because we'll always need different systems for these functions, I think, because there's no silver bullet battery which does everything perfectly.
My impression is that currently large-scale storage systems or grid storage systems are lithium-ion batteries. Where do you or who buys your batteries, and where are they installed?
Well, lithium, let's just talk a little about lithium first. What we have to bear in mind is that lithium batteries were first commercialized in 1991. That's a long time ago. And lithium batteries were originally commercialized by Sony for things like camcorders. So this is where that technology started, and this is what was originally intended for. And back then, I think if you'd said to people, we're going to build gigantic versions of these and use them for storing gigawatts and gigawatt hours of energy, they would have tapped their forehead and said, "You're absolutely crazy," because it's a wonderful system, but it does have one key drawback. And I think it's an interesting question: why was it Sony that commercialized the lithium-ion battery and not one of the battery companies? Sony never made batteries before, and the answer is that the lithium chemistry, they're looking for high energy density, and in doing that went to a different chemistry where the batteries actually, the electrolyte these batteries use is flammable. It can catch fire and burn, and in extreme cases it can explode. And the battery industry were concerned about, how do we make a battery that won't blow up, which they tried to solve electrochemistry. And what Sony did was said, well, we're an electronics company, so why don't we just put an electronic control system in place that will prevent the battery from getting into a dangerous state and shut it down before it catches fire? So that was a brilliant piece of engineering, which made it possible to introduce lithium-ion batteries. And over time, that type of architecture of using control systems, external control systems, to prevent the battery getting in a dangerous state has never changed. So companies have got extremely good at mastering the engineering behind that, which is why lithium-ion batteries don't blow up very often, but they do blow up or catch fire, and it's intrinsic to the chemistry of them. It's just really a testament to the engineering skills of the companies making them that they've managed to mitigate that risk pretty well. But coming back to your question, who is interested in a redox flow battery? One thing for sure is that people who are concerned about fire risk, because if you have a system which uses a water-based electrolyte that can't burn, that can't really happen. And so again, I want to take a very sort of technology agnostic view of this. I mean, I'm not saying that lithium ion batteries are fundamentally dangerous. I'm just saying there's a theoretical risk there. It can happen. There are control systems being developed which are effective at stopping that. But there's some people, but occasionally things do go wrong. And for people who worry about that, then flow batteries become interesting. But the other element of which I think is important is a lithium-ion battery is a humongously complicated system. They look very simple because it looks like a battery, but what's going on inside the battery is every time you charge and discharge the battery, in a perfect world, the battery would, every time you charge it and discharge it, it would return to exactly the same state as before. But chemistry is imprecise. That never happens. So every time you charge and discharge a battery, the chemistry changes a little bit. So closed cells like lithium batteries, over time, changes in the chemistry accumulate through use. And that's what drives things like capacity loss or other changes in characteristics. So ultimately, they have a finite life. One advantage of a flow battery, where the electrolyte is in external tanks, is, it's also an electrochemical system. You also have unwanted side reactions. The difference is that you actually have an ability to put some system in place that will correct the chemistry, or it will compensate for unwanted side reactions and put the system back into its planned operating mode. And that's actually one of the key pieces of the iron flow battery. So what that means from a user point of view is that the iron flow battery has no capacity degradation over time. It's not because the chemistry is perfect, it's because it has an additional device in there which compensates for imperfection in the chemical process. So the other area of attraction for the iron flow battery is for people who want to build a battery that's going to last for 20 years or more, because it is you don't have this closed system where accumulation of chemical change over time means it inevitably has to be replaced at some point in time. I'd say probably the third one is for very, very large batteries, because people will get less worried about huge quantities of iron dissolved in salt water than they get about other types of chemical systems, if I can call it that. So if you're going to be storing large amounts of energy, you have to remember that, I'd say the most succinct thing to say about batteries is it's quite easy to make them do what you want them to do, which is to store energy. It's much harder to make sure they don't do the things you don't want them to do, like blow up, catch fire, or misbehave in some shape or form. And flow batteries have a more benign behavior because of the nature of the chemicals used inside them.
Does this mean that a redox flow battery has an infinite life, or the electrolyte at least?
The electrolyte conditioning system functioning correctly will mean that the electrolyte will maintain the same operating condition over the entire life of the battery. But what I would say, as I say, nothing lasts forever, but the analogy is more like if you can visit a hydroelectric plant that's 100 years old. Mm-hmm. Not everything in there is 100 years old. I mean, some of the electric motors will have been changed, and switches will have been changed, and some of the components over time will be replaced, but it's still there. And it's really a bit more like that. In a flow battery, you have a system where you're moving electrolyte around, and you'll almost certainly need to replace pumps and filters and things over time. But it's more like a kind of maintainable system, like we're used to in other factories and places, than something where it's a closed box which you have to throw it away when it doesn't meet the performance criteria anymore.
And what does that mean for the cost of a kilowatt hour? I mean, is it competitive? What is the cost of a kilowatt hour stored in your system compared to other ones?
This is where one of the most important concepts, I think, is to talk about not the cost per kilowatt hour, but maybe the levelized cost of storage, which unfortunately there are several different ways of calculating it, but the concept of the levelized cost of storage is to capture not just the things like the initial capex, but also how long does it last? How much energy have I been able to throughput through the system over time? And that is sort of emerging as one of the most important ways of comparing battery systems, because if it's calculated correctly, it gives you effectively the cost, assuming the battery operates for its planned lifetime. It gives you the cost per kilowatt hour of the stored energy. And I'm always one to say be very cautious about these numbers being bandied around, because they're extremely sensitive to all kinds of operating parameters. And I'll give you one which is a very topical thing right now. The levelized cost of storage of a battery depends tremendously on whether or how much you have to pay for the energy for charging it. And so, you know, you have at one extreme people saying you should pay batteries to absorb energy because they're helping stabilize the grid by absorbing surplus energy when you have a surplus energy. There are other people who say, well, in fact, a battery is just like any other consumer of electricity. If it's going to be charged with energy, they should pay the same amount as everybody else. And if we put a little historical item on that, why was one of the reasons why Germany was initially slow about battery deployment in some areas is because the way in which the German power grid set the rules meant that the batteries, in fact, were the only devices in the power grid that paid transmission charges twice, once when you charged it and once when you discharged it. That has been fixed. That was one of the commitments of the coalition government when they came into power. They did fix that. But what I'm trying to say is that you have to look at a specific use case to actually give a number which actually means anything. Otherwise, it's and this is a fundamental issue with all batteries. The evaluation of the economics of a battery is only really correct for a very specific use case where you define all of these parameters. Now, if I come back to why is that a topical issue right now, Germany and most of Europe has had a surge of hours of negative energy prices. This is where you have a debate where the skeptics about renewables say, look, we've massively overbuilt renewables, and it's terrible because it makes no sense to be building stuff where you have to pay people to take the output. But the real problem is we just haven't built enough storage. But the interesting question is, where do you land in storage in a world where with solar, for sure, you have everybody massively overproducing. You have a massive overproduction of electricity around lunchtime, which notionally it's simple. You just need to store that and use it later in the day. But the question about what do you pay for that energy at the moment is still hotly debated. If you look at energy markets, the price should be negative, i.e. people should be taking it off your hands because the surplus has to go somewhere, and then you can use it later in the day. So going back to your question about what does it store to cost a kilowatt hour of energy, I'd say the biggest variable at this point in time is actually, or one of the biggest question marks is exactly that. What are you going to have to pay to charge it? I think what will emerge from this is that certainly the prices for charging batteries, I don't think they'll ever be negative. I think what will happen over time as you have more, you have to move to a situation where the prices for charging batteries will be low but not negative, because it ultimately it doesn't really make much sense to be encouraging people to build solar and then basically say, well, you're going to have to pay somebody to take the output off your hands. It's a temporary situation right now because we don't actually have the mechanisms for using it. Sorry, yeah. Go ahead.
If I'm just thinking, if I am an investor and I would like to buy or to install a battery, for example, one of these net boosters, as they are called in Germany, where large grid storage systems are installed. How do I compare your system or an iron flow battery with a lithium ion battery that are installed right now? So somehow I have to make this decision, and there have to be parameters that I have to take into account.
You basically build a techno-economic model for your specific project, and that's the only way you can do it.
Okay, and I mean, what I'm trying to figure out is what is the right, I mean, what is the, or where can I see batteries that you have installed and that are ideal for this certain use case?
Well, one thing I have that's a little bit of a limitation for me. ESS is a publicly quoted company, so I can only refer stuff that's already been announced. But if you look on the ESS website, you'll see reference of a number of projects. There are some in Europe. There are some systems installed, and ESS is right at the is bringing a new technology to market. So there's a lot more things unannounced than are announced. And but we have to stick to the rules on that. If you wanted to actually go and see a battery, we could certainly organize that, and you could put your hands on it and take photographs and whatever you wish.
Sorry, no, I was just thinking that what are the reasons that these customers of yours decided to buy your battery? Okay,
well, I mean, there's the other point, of course, there's more of them in the US than there are here. Well, one reason for sure is fire risk. And the company announced a project which with Schiphol Airport, for example, where they want to use our battery to bulk store electricity, because what they're doing is, if you're at an airport, you see there's lots of small generators and things powered by diesels. Cumulatively, those devices produce an incredible amount of CO2 because they're running continuously. And Schiphol has a very ambitious and praiseworthy project to electrify everything on the ground. And if you're going to electrify everything on the ground, you need lots of electricity. And if you can't produce all of that electricity at time, you want to do something like charge the battery with offshore wind, which there's a lot of it being built in the Netherlands. So that's a very interesting use case. And if you have aircraft and kerosene and stuff around, you'd rather have a battery that's not going which has no fire risk. So that, for example, is a use case where it's dominated by, I'd say, overall safety. And in some of the that's also a thread in the US. You have certain manufacturing plants where they just don't want to have anything on site that could be an additional fire hazard. But there are other projects. There's been a lot written in the US about various other projects where the focus is much more just on bulk storage, big systems, huge batteries, and there you have also a desire to find a system which, at scale, the actual target in all of these things is to make the cost of renewable energy plus storage cheaper than gas. That is the real tipping point, because, and we're almost there actually, and that's because if you look at even somewhere like California, they've built a huge amount of renewables, but it's really 30% renewables combined with 60% gas. The actual decarbonization part is still for the bulk of it is still to happen. And for that, the combination of renewable energy plus storage, you want that to drop to a point where it's at the similar price point to gas, because then it means that electricity bills will go down and not up. So those kind of projects, there are a number of them being announced. The focus is basically driving scale, because scale drives cost and cost drives scale. You have this virtuous circle, which lithium started on 20 years ago. So got a bit of catching up to do, but as I say, I would say really those are the two principal areas where where the concern about safety and permitting and fire risk and these kind of things is definitely a focal point. And the other one is looking for really huge batteries, bulk storage of energy, as part of this next transition into territory where so far it's been dominated by gas peaker plants.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. This battery system at Schiphol Airport, what size does it have? It's
not huge. It's basically, this is part of a test program which they're running. They're testing all kinds of things. Mm-hmm. You can read about it on the internet. They're part of the so-called Tulips program, which is an EU-wide program to try and determine a blueprint for how airport ground operations can be decarbonized.
Mm-hmm. All right. Do you think that maybe in the future flow batteries can play a crucial role in decarbonizing the transport sector? I mean, not cars or trucks, but ships, for example. Is that?
I don't think so. I think that for ships, flow batteries are. They're not optimized for space or weight. Mm. And I think that it will. It's for things like shipping. It would. I think to put a large enough flow battery together to power a ship is unlikely to be economic. I mean, there's plenty of other solutions being considered there with alternative fuels, but we also have to bear in mind that the reason we use hydrocarbons is because they're a gift of nature, that nature spent millions of years producing this incredibly highly energy density concentrated material, and powering ships, they use a lot of electricity. So I think you'll see. I personally don't think you'll ever see a flow battery powering a ship. I think you might see them on land, mm-hmm. Storing the energy for charging an electric short-range car ferry, for example. Mm-hmm. I mean, there's work being done like in Norway. There's actually quite a lot of relatively short section ferries and the fjords, which are entirely electric, mm-hmm. and they go back and forward, but they need to be charged, and for that you need bulk storage of energy. That I could imagine. Mm-hmm. I could also imagine flow batteries being used for bulk storage of energy to support EV charging infrastructure. Because you need bulk energy there too, because people will come up in their car, plug into the fast charger. The fast charger will charge their vehicle, but if that happens multiple times throughout the day, you need a lot of energy for that. So I think I personally view flow batteries in fixed installations on land, bulk storage of energy in areas where you're worried about, or you're looking for a system which has a very good safety profile. Mm.
So you would say in the future, and regarding the energy transition, flow batteries will play a crucial role, or at least become more widespread?
They'll definitely become more widespread. I think right now, again, coming back to Germany, they're very relevant for the raging debate about gas peaker plants. Mm-hmm. This is a huge topic. A big part of the energy transition in Germany is about how to manage simultaneously exiting coal and nuclear. Mm. And so I think a large flow battery is a commercially viable alternative to a gas peaker plant. Mm-hmm. Especially, there's a debate that still needs to take place. Germany's plan to build a brand new gas turbines and power them with green hydrogen. If that's your use case, then a flow battery is going to be, in my opinion, a vastly more effective solution than generating hydrogen, storing hydrogen, and then burning it tomorrow. which is so to your question, I would say that I think that to look at things like gas peaker plant replacement, flow batteries are an interesting alternative for part of that. Not for all of it, but for part of it, for sure.
And are you already in talks with the major transmission system operators to install your iron flow batteries also in Germany?
Well, we are in talks to some large companies in Germany. We've announced some of that. But as I say, other discussions, we have to respect the confidentiality of these kind of discussions. But I would say generically, there's definitely interest in bulk storage of energy, because we're at this point now where everybody can see that to move to the next phase of decarbonization, we need to be able to store energy today and use it sometime in the next 24 hours. And I think it's an exciting time. It should not be surprising to anybody we're here. It was entirely predictable, and it's exactly what we want to happen. It's also what the German government want to happen, with their solar plan and the plans to build up to 215 gigawatts of generation. Because if you look at what's basically happened over the last 15 years, people were sitting around in 2010 saying, if only solar was cheap. Guess what happened? If only wind was cheap, guess what happened? If only lithium batteries were cheap, guess what happened? And now we need this bulk storage as the fourth element of that transition. And in fact, renewable energy can be cheaper than hydrocarbons. It's a different business model because you have a fixed capex infrastructure, but you have no fuel cost. And so I think we're actually in the last item 4 of 4 to make all of these things work, and then they all work together. And it is going to happen. I'm convinced of that. And as I say, I think that to come back to the thread of this discussion, flow batteries and iron flow batteries are part of this. When I'm always asked to compare with the other technologies, my answer is we need all of them, everything that works, every single one of them we need, because I think it's the scale of the task is still huge. A lot of people, they start talking about gigawatts and terawatts, and they should take a piece of paper and write down the number of zeros that a terawatt actually means, and then think about what that is in terms of how much infrastructure you need. But the good news is that I would say that of all of the key technologies we need, the solar generation, wind generation, short duration batteries are already at the cost points for this to be competitive without subsidies. That's an important point. And we add the fourth element to that, and then we can look forward to decarbonized energy at very attractive prices.
Alan, thank you so much for these insights into flow batteries and into the battery markets. Thank you.
It's my pleasure, and I'll be happy to follow up anytime in the future when there's an update is of interest.
Thank you. That was the Solar Investors Guide podcast. Of course, we hope you enjoyed it. But even if not, feel free to write to me. I'm also happy to receive ideas for topics, questions, and other suggestions. My email address is schaefer@photovoltaic.eu. And if you don't want to miss out on any more investor topics, please visit our website at pveurope.eu/investors and sign up for our newsletter. You can also find the link and all other information in the show notes to this podcast.